Hi, folks. David here. And I guess I call this story time. I guess I just have a little story to tell you about a German POW and his family that my parents got to know quite well in the early and mid 1950s. This is before I was born, but I've heard my parents tell the story many times. Heinrich Stahl. Heinrich Stahl was the name of this young German Navy uh, personnel, sailor, and he served on the German battleship, the Graf Spee. And if you know your World War II history, you'll know that the Graf Spee was cornered and eventually scuttled by the German Navy. It was cornered by the Royal Navy outside of Montevideo in Uruguay in South America in December of 1939. And knowing that they were trapped, the Germans scuttled the ship outside of the harbor. And all of the crew of the Graf Spee, including including Heinrich, a young Heinrich Stahl, were interned by the Uruguayan government. Now, and then they spent a couple of years in POW camp in Uruguay. Then in 1942, Uruguay cut diplomatic relations with Germany, became an ally of the Allies. And then in 1942, all of these Graf Spee POWs were shipped to Canada. So here now, a young Heinrich Stahl finds himself in Canada. And these POWs, many of them who were compliant, accepting what had happened to them, they're not diehard Nazis. They were given the opportunity to do farm work, to get out of the camps and to go and live with farm families and be farmhands when many young Canadian guys are off to war. So these farmers, these more middle-aged and older farmers needed farmhands. So a number of these many German POWs agreed to live with farm families and do farm work. And every once in a while, Canadian officials would go and check up on them. But these guys, and this Heinrich would tell my father years later that he knew there was no escape and he didn't want to get back to Germany and he'd never be able to get back anyway. So might as well make the most of it. And so, working with his farm family in southern Ontario, he taught himself and learned English. Now, so for years, he's working for this family. This is years before he meets my father, but he was working for this farm family. And then come May of 1945, the war is over. Germany has surrendered. And then he and hundreds of thousands of other German POWs in Canada, they get shipped back to Germany because after the war, well, they're to be sent back home. And so Heinrich Stahl finds himself back in Germany in 1945. And then Germany in 1945, 46, 47, life is grim. And he eventually went on to tell my father later on that there was nothing for him. Most of his family was dead. Germany was in rubble. There was nothing for him. And then in 1948, he heard that Canada was opening up immigration to people from Germany and that so he's eligible to apply. And it would help his case if he had a Canadian sponsor. So he wrote to this farm family in southern Ontario saying he wants to immigrate to Canada and would they be willing to hire him and to support his application. And so they wrote back and said yes. And so he gets the money together and well, now he's married by this time, a young wife. And so he and his wife get on a ship and they sail to Halifax and then they get in, and then they have their papers, and he's got his letter of endorsement from this farm family in southern Ontario. He has a job waiting for him, and he could speak English pretty well. And so he gets into Canada and he goes to this farm and he spends a number of years, 3 or 4 years, again, working on the same farm. And then now, so here he's in Canada, early 1950s. He's getting tired of the farm work, and there's more and more job opportunities in Toronto. And so he moves to Toronto with his family, and now he's got a young baby. So now this is where my family comes in. He's in Toronto and he's looking for a place to live. Now, it turns out in the early 50s, my parents had moved into the family house that I remember, and they were looking to take in a renter, a set of rooms upstairs. So they put an advertisement in the paper, and who applies but Heinrich Stahl and his family. So then in the early 50s, my parents bring in the Stahl family to live upstairs. Now, this is before I was born, but my older brothers vaguely remember this. And so I've heard the stories. And so here, there's this German family living upstairs in my parents' house. Now, again, you're getting a sense of my family through this course. Here, like my dad fought in the Second World War. My uncles on my mom's side fought in the Second World War, and one spent 2 years in Italy. So here, not even 10 years after the war is over, my parents have a German family, an ex-POW, living upstairs in our house in the East End of Toronto. So that's Canadian immigration, one level. And and then one of the funny stories my dad would say in the mid 50s, dad was a scout troop leader. And this one, he said he would always tell the story. This one night, a weeknight, he has a bunch of scouts, a bunch of young boys, 8, 9, 10-year-old boys, sitting around the dining room table. And he is teaching them Morse code. Now, back in the war, my dad was in the wireless uh, corps, and he was a radio operator and a wireless and a Morse code operator. And he was superb at doing Morse code. So again, remember the Morse code. Like you'd be tapping out, if you could hear that, you'd be tapping out the messages on the Morse code device. Dit, dit, dash, dash, dit, dit, dash, dash, dit, dit. And you could type out the entire language. You could type out messages doing Morse code. So here this one evening, he had this old Morse code device. It wasn't hooked up to anything, but it was just the old device he had teaching the kids the alphabet in the Morse code and typing out little messages. And that you would eventually, you get good enough, you could just understand what the messages are and understand them and then send messages out and receive messages like that. So he's tapping away, showing the kids on this old Morse code machine how to tap out Morse code. So dad said as he was doing that, he heard Mr. Stahl come running down the stairs. And now dad is in the dining room with the boys. Mr. Stahl came running down the stairs, and dad said he came into the dining room and he was absolutely white, white with fear. And said, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Johnson. And then dad said he was looking down at this Morse code device on the table, not plugged into anything. And he was looking, he was just white. He said, Mr. Johnson, what are you doing? And then dad saw he was petrified, absolutely petrified. And then dad sort of got it. He said, oh, no, no, nothing. No, Heinrich, don't worry, don't worry. It's not plugged into anything. I'm not sending any message. I'm just teaching the boys. I'm just teaching the boys how to do Morse code. And then finally dad calmed him down. And then I said, don't worry, don't worry. I'm not sending any messages. He feared, Heinrich feared that my dad was contacting the government in Ottawa, talking about the German upstairs, right? But this is the family stories that I grew up with. The young guy from the Graf Spee who ends up as a he becomes through working on a farm family as a POW. He learns English. He has a family connection to Canada. He ends up living upstairs in the second floor of the house I grew up in. And then when I came along, my parents needed those rooms, and so the stalls went out the door, and I as a little baby came in. But I remember hearing all of these stories. So again, that's an immigrant. That's an immigrant story, and I'm sure the Stahl family, there'd be people in the Stahl family who would be hearing these stories from their grandparents and the little daughter who started her life in my family house. Anyway, folks, that's just another immigrant story and how the history of immigration has touched my family. And I'll be coming at you again with another story. So in the meantime, you guys take care, stay safe, and I'll be talking to you again soon.